Hello everyone, I hope you're staying warm in this very chilly weather, at least for those of us that are in Michigan. As I'm sure you've noticed, I'm a little late grading your quizzes. So here's the deal. When I'm unreasonably late grading quizzes, I will give you guys extra credit. Okay, so you're guaranteed at least 1 point extra credit. I will also have your quiz back to you by the end of this week, which is when your second quiz is going to be due. Okay, so the second quiz should be over just lectures 5 and 6. Okay, so this last quiz will be over lectures 5 and 6. Today's lecture will be on the next quiz. Okay, and I realize the quizzes bundle up on us real quick. I'm sorry about that. That's the one downside of having a mini course. Okay, if you guys have any questions, concerns, or complaints, let me know. My goal is to have your quizzes graded and back to you by Tuesday at the absolute latest. That way you guys can know what I expect for the next quiz. That won't be due until the following Friday, Friday of this week. If you run into any issues again, please let me know. I think you guys will do fine because of the fact it's open note, open book. As long as you cited your sources, you're good. The next quiz will be very similar in format, so there's no surprises. All right, so the next topic that we're going to cover in this class are genetically modified organisms, otherwise known as GMOs. Okay, so I remember when GMOs first came out. You guys might not. They've been around for quite a while. Realistically speaking, though, people really had a panic about GMOs. And based on what we're going to learn today, I honestly think that was a bit overblown. I understand people's concern. I'm always very hesitant when it comes to things like this. But honestly, the science has kind of convinced me otherwise, and we'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. If you guys remember before, we talked about the topic of artificial selection, and this is when humans select either for or against a trait. If you also remember, we discussed that in the grocery store, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi all came from the wild mustard plant, okay, and they were given the traits they have now through the process of artificial selection. This is basically everything I hated as a kid. Well, sort of. Close to it. Anyway, so it's because of humans selecting for or against traits that we have all of these different vegetables. But remember, we've been toying with the genome now for hundreds, almost 100 years, if not more, through the process of artificial selection. So when it comes to genetic engineering, we've kind of been doing our own version of it. Okay, so you might be asking, well, what's the difference between artificial selection and GMO? And I would say, aha, that's an excellent question. So what the difference is that artificial selection, we're selecting for or against traits, but we're still crossing the plants. They would still normally cross in nature, okay? Whereas in GMOs, you're crossing species that most of the time would never cross. You can't have, for example, glowfish, and we'll talk more about glowfish later, but they're basically the glow gene from a jellyfish is inserted into a fish, and that would never happen in nature, and that's kind of why everybody is so worried about it. So you guys might have heard the term molecular cloning before, okay? And molecular cloning in the biology lab 173, this used to be an experiment. I don't think it can be, obviously, right now because of the fact that we're all stuck at home, but back in the year before, molecular cloning was one of the labs that was performed. And the cool part about that is you basically create glowing bacteria. How awesome is that? Well, I think it's awesome. Maybe I need to get out more like my husband says. But anyway, the way this happens is you cut out the insert gene or the glow gene from the jellyfish. Okay, that's step number 1, and it's in the upper left. So the jellyfish has its own genome, and you use certain things called restriction enzymes to cut out the gene that you're interested in. In this case, it's the one that causes glowing. Then you have to use what's called a vector. Okay, and a vector is what actually delivers your strip of DNA to what's going to be as your host. Okay, so you cut the vector, and then you basically go to step number 3 where you ligate or you glue that gene in the vector. Okay. Then what happens is you put that ligated vector with its gene in there in a solution, okay, with the bacteria that you want to do what's called transforming. Now, the way you transform bacteria is you do what's called heat shocking them, okay? So you get them really, really hot and you make them sweat. Just kidding. But you do get them hot, and then all of a sudden you put them in a cold bucket of ice. So the drastic temperature shift actually causes their membrane to flip inside out. And then once things go back to normal, it flips outside in. And by doing so, when that second step happens, it will drag some of the bacteria, will drag the vector with the new gene inside of the cell. Okay? When that happens, you've transformed the bacteria, and therefore your bacteria can now produce glowing protein and will start to glow. Okay? And that's called molecular cloning. Make sure that that makes sense. Okay, I want you guys to be informed when you decide whether or not you are worried about GMOs. And this is definitely a GMO experiment, okay, because the jellyfish gene and the bacteria would normally never come into contact with one another in nature. Okay, so it would normally not exchange genes or cross or anything along those lines, which is why this is defined as a GMO. So let's talk about how long humans have been modifying crops, okay? So for tens of thousands of years, we began to domesticate crops using artificial selection, otherwise known as selective breeding. Okay, by the 1700s, farmers and scientists started cross-breeding plants within a species. 40s and 50s, scientists were trying to find a better way. By the 80s, this is when they started genetically engineering. Okay, and in 1990, the first GMO was introduced to the marketplace. I think it was corn, tomatoes. Can't remember exactly. Could have also been bacteria. Oh, wait. No, I do remember exactly because we're going to talk about it. Sorry. And I will tell you that when we get to that particular slide. So in order to genetically modify an organism, you have to have two components. One is called the host, and the second is called the vector. Okay? So the host is defined as the critter that you are going to genetically modify or that you are going to transform. Okay? And the vector is the method that you use to do the transformation. Okay, the last example, the host would have been the bacteria, and the vector was the plasmid, which remember is just that ring of DNA. Now, when it comes to bacteria, the hosts are the bacteria, as I said, and the vectors tend to be the plasmids. It's not always that way, but plasmids tend to transform bacteria relatively decently. Now, in the larger critters, like mice and, bigger plants and so forth, they use viruses. Okay, so viruses can be genetically engineered to become a vector, where they do an excellent job at delivering DNA to a cell, because that's what a virus does. And so scientists have basically taken that idea and then modified the DNA a bit in those viruses to pass on traits that they want to go to the host, okay? So this is how critters are actually transformed. The larger critters are transformed is by using a virus. And if you think about it, they do really well at that job, so they pretty much have perfected it. So you might be asking yourself, well, when did genetically modified creatures come about and how are they used? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent idea. So back in the day, long before genetic modification came about, it used to be really difficult for diabetics to get insulin. Okay, and so I don't know how much you all know about diabetes, but basically what happens is you have glucose that enters the bloodstream through eating. Okay, eating sugar, eating whatever. And then your body is supposed to produce insulin to where the insulin helps these cells soak up the glucose. And you want that to happen because if you have too much sugar floating around in your blood, your organs get damaged. Okay? Now, insulin resistance is when your glucose cannot enter the cells because there's too much of it circulating in the bloodstream. So the insulin is no longer produced. Now, this tends to happen in type 2 diabetes, okay, where the insulin resistance, basically, I have type 2, my husband also has type 2 diabetes, and we've kind of worn out our bodies to the point of where the insulin doesn't recognize sugar anymore and doesn't do its job. So you have to have medication these days to be able to, once you eat, okay. Now, type 1 diabetes, insulin is not produced. All right, and so type 1 diabetes in the day used to be fatal until doctors started realizing this and then creating insulin. Well, back in the day, insulin used to come from, the insulin for diabetics used to come from the pancreas of slaughtered animals. It was very crude, wasn't very pure, sometimes could make people sick. It was definitely not the greatest way to get your insulin. And this is where genetic modification comes into play. So what doctors and scientists started to look for is a way to get insulin from another source. So they didn't have to rely on slaughtered animals. So that is where genetic engineering started to be used. So they would take some bacteria, transform it with a gene to make insulin, And then once they did, the bacteria would sit there and make insulin, and then they could take those bacterial colonies, separate the actual bacteria components from the insulin, and then they could give the insulin to diabetics. So one of the first uses of GMOs was to make clean insulin to be able to give to type 1 diabetics, and possibly type 2 before there were certain drugs out there that are able to do that now. So definitely a good use. I'm a fan. Okay, not gonna lie, type 2 diabetic. If you've ever had too much blood or too much sugar in your blood, hopefully you haven't. It's really uncomfortable and eventually will cause you to go blind, to lose organs, to lose appendages. It just, yeah, it's really uncomfortable. So, this was definitely a wonderful thing to have. Other uses for GMOs started in agriculture. Okay, so corn, they could select for certain traits and so forth, but when they started to run into issues with the pests, okay, and parasites, and so corn definitely became engineered to try and keep the pests away. We'll talk about more of that in a second. Tomatoes also became engineered, and so they actually were engineered for a couple different things, one of which is durability, okay? You might also think that they were engineered for flavor, which they kind of were, but also for color, for shape, for size. That a lot of that actually came through artificial selection, but durability couldn't, okay, because tomatoes are just mush. So durability was definitely what they were trying to get with the GMO modification, because otherwise they couldn't really ship tomatoes very far. And if you go to the grocery stores now, in fact, the next time you guys go, look for heirloom tomatoes, okay? And if you find them, you'll see that they're in their own very special packaging. That's because they're not durable, okay? So they can ship them now. But back in the day, before they had so much plastic, which, bad for the environment, I get that. But that was actually a problem. So the GM modification definitely, had some good things. Now, when it comes to getting rid of pests, GM modification, genetic modification, was really useful. And so what scientists that worked for large chemical companies started to do was to produce crops that were what's known as Roundup ready, okay, meaning that you could use Roundup to kill off any other type of plant that except your crop, because your crop was immune to Roundup. Okay, now Roundup's relatively toxic. People don't use it now as much as they used to back in the day. The same worked for designing crops that would kill insects, okay, and so were resistant to insects. So there's all sorts of examples of these. The reason people tend to be a bit leery about this is because a lot of private companies like Monsanto and that keep things private. And so they say that something is proprietary. Well, a lot of us want to know what's actually going in that, into those chemicals and so forth. And so, you have to kind of be careful with a lot of that stuff. Again, I'm kind of in the middle of the fence, and we'll talk about an example where I think people are too worried about genetic modification when they really shouldn't be. Now, in many countries, rice is a huge staple for a lot of different cultures. And, this is understandable. It's grown easily and readily. And so, it does a nice job to feed the people who live in certain areas. Now, the problem, though, is that for many of these areas, malnutrition is a big deal. And getting all the vitamins is a big deal. So scientists went about creating what's called golden rice. Now, golden rice has a precursor to vitamin A in it, which means that once you consume it, your body can then use it to make vitamin A. Sounds like a great idea. I'm all for it. Let's get rid of malnutrition, all of these issues, and get people the vitamins they need. But unfortunately, a lot of people who are in the different countries that need this decided they don't want it because it's genetically modified. This is a situation where I think is being way overprotective. I think, try it out, and if it can help the people, great. I can tell you the scientists who made this were even willing to give it to these countries for free, okay? But again, the countries wouldn't take them, which is a little bit frustrating. So now the next time you guys go to Meijer or a pet store, I'd like you to look for the glowfish, okay? So I noticed recently they even have glowfish that are beta. So what the glowfish are, they are genetically modified critters. And if you'll recall, we had discussed glowing bacteria. Well, these guys were also transformed using that same gene. Okay, so they took the gene out of the jellyfish, they used a virus, they put it in with the fish picked up the gene and started to be transformed, and now we have glowfish. Okay, and again, as I said recently, we started to have glowing betas, which, just in my lifetime, that's something that's completely new. We never used to have that when I was a kid. So I'm always amazed, what science can do. So if you, the other thing I wanted to tell you about this is that this is the first commercially available genetically modified creature for humans. Okay, so this is the first one that we can actually go out and buy. I suspect the glow beta would be next, but also a fish still, but these guys are actually tetras. And so they're glow tetras, whereas the betas are glowing betas. But, all of them are pretty interesting. So let's talk about the controversy. And so I've said this before, just a few slides ago. I genuinely think if you consider how long humans have been manipulating genes of plants and animals, okay, through artificial selection, I really think this is kind of blown out of proportion because, as we're going to talk about, there really isn't any data to show that this is a bad thing, okay, at least not yet. You guys, I want you to make your own informed decisions. I will tell you I have arguments with this in my own family because really there is nothing natural. Everything that you see in a grocery store, humans have done something to it one way or another genetically. So there's no like real natural, plants or animals to eat. Okay, so it's stuff that we've all somehow altered one way or the other, the genetics. So I'm not saying we should go willy-nilly. I'm not saying I trust the big companies. Okay, I'm this cynic in me is always, taking a deep breath, waiting to see, but just something for you all to consider as you learn more about science in this class. One of the better modifications that I think has been made are tomatoes that are crossed with blueberries. Okay, and you might be asking yourself, why in the world would anybody cross a tomato? Or what they did was they put blueberry genes into tomatoes. Well, as we discussed malnutrition and children get their vitamins and so forth, many kids won't eat blueberries. But if you all recall, blueberries have a lot of antioxidants in them. They're supposed to be really good for you. So even though kids won't touch blueberries, many times they will eat things like ketchup or tomatoes in salads, maybe. Or, spaghetti sauce or something like that. So if you produce tomatoes that you cross with blueberries that have all the good antioxidants, it's a nice way to sneak some vegetables into your kids, okay? And having had a child, she came to live with me when she was 14, she wouldn't even consider touching anything healthy until she was older. But by then, she's already done her growing. And so, at that point in time, it was too late. So it's kind of a nice way to sneaking in the veggies, fruits and veggies and so forth, to get that healthy stuff out of them. So I'm not going to lie, this is kind of where I start drawing the line when it comes to genetic modification. So researchers in Japan have started actually crossing pigs with spinach genes. But they've taken spinach genes and they've introduced them into pigs. I have kind of an ethical dilemma with this one, just because you're crossing a plant with an animal. That's just my own personal opinion, not representative of Michigan or any of its subsidiaries. Just kidding. It's just, I just kind of think that's a little dicey. And the ethics comes in when really only about a third of the pigs survive. Okay, so when you start crossing kingdoms like that, that just, that's really harsh on the animals. And, for the idea was that you get spinach genes into bacon and people eat bacon and pass them on to the humans. But I think I'd rather eat the spinach. But again, that's just me. All right, I will admit when GMOs first came out, I was pretty hesitant to try them too. This was years ago, okay, a decade or two. However, I've waited for science to really kick in and show me the data. So when somebody says something, I'm like, all right, show me the data. And so not too long ago, a study came out where researchers conducted what's called a meta-analysis. Okay, in a meta-analysis, what you do is you gather all sorts of different papers on a particular topic that are published on something that's, related to what you're asking, and then you reanalyze the data and you look for patterns and see what you find. Okay, cows have been fed GMOs since the 1950s when the first GMOs came out in corn. Okay. Or definitely been artificial selection. I think the first corn that was modified came out in the 80s. But they've been, fed artificially selected for and GMO corn for the longest time. So researchers, these guys were a stealthy bunch. And what they did is they gathered all of the different papers they could find where cows were eating GMO corn. And what they looked to see was whether or not they found any adverse effects that could be contributed to eating genetically modified food. Okay? Now, I will tell you as a scientist, you're lucky to get a couple hundred data points. If things go really well, you might get 1,000. When they conducted this meta-analysis, they actually had 100 billion animals / 100 different data points to look at. This was insane, okay? Nobody has this kind of data set. And they actually could not find any evidence that suggested, at least for the cows, GMOs were causing a health problem. This really changed my mind on science and changed my position on GMOs. I'm not going to lie. 100 billion animals, that's a lot of data points, okay? Now, the things you do have to keep in mind, A, cows tend to have a relatively short lifespan because unfortunately we consume them, okay? B, we're not cows, which I'm grateful for, realistically speaking, and so there might be differences between cows and humans, particularly since the cows don't live that long before they're slaughtered, okay? However, not going to lie, first thing I say is show me the data, and they definitely presented the data in this, and as I said, I'm way less leery about GMOs than I used to be. But I want you guys to make up your mind. Okay, there is no wrong answer to this, and there's no right answer to this. You have to figure out what you guys think and how comfortable you are as you go to the grocery store. Now, another potential complication for GMOs that people were worried about was whether or not genetically engineered crops would hurt the environment. So would the genes cross over to other species? Would they start causing issues? Would the genetics just run amok? And the reality is there was another study done by a different group of scientists that basically overviewed the last 10 years of genetically engineered crops, looking to see if there was any evidence that they were wreaking havoc on the environment or doing something bad to other plants. And it turns out that there's no evidence of this, okay? So 10 years worth of data of genetic modification, and then once again, not having any evidence of something bad happening. I think the data is pretty solid, but again, it's not perfect. There's always weird exceptions, especially in science and nature, as we know. But again, I want you guys to always be informed as you make up your minds. So, I realize this is a relatively short lecture. You guys do have a quiz this week, okay? And this question is going to be on the quiz. Did I mention this will be on the quiz? Because this question is going to be on the quiz, all right? I basically want to know your opinions on GMO, okay, and artificial selection. I'm asking you this on the quiz. And I want you to tell me, based on what you've learned, do you feel they're safe or not safe? Do you think we should use them or not? There's no right or wrong answer. What I'm looking for is for you guys to build your argument based on what you've learned, okay? That's the entire purpose of this class, is for you guys to learn this information. It's based on scientific data, and I want you to become informed and develop an opinion on something, okay? So I'm going to ask you, what do you think of GMO crops? What do you think of artificial selection? Do you have any concerns about this based on what we talked about in class, and justify your answer. Something along those lines with the wording, all right? Okay, if you guys have any questions on this, please let me know. Otherwise, I will chat with you again in the next lecture, which I'm hoping to get uploaded very soon. Talk to you soon.